Classicist London series. And today we have Thibault Clérice from the Ecole Nationale de Chartres that will talk about CapiTainS, challenges for the generalization and adoption of open source software. But before I hand it over to Thibault, I just wanted to remind you that our next seminar is Rune Rattenborg from Durham and Uppsala University that will be talking about further and further into the woods, lessons from the crossroads of cuneiform studies, landscape archaeology, and spatial humanities research. So during the seminar, feel free to ask questions in the comments of the YouTube channel, on the Twitter using the hashtag DigiClass. And I think that's all for the introduction. And thank you, Thibault.
Thank you for the invitation. So I just want to, share screen. That's a good idea. That would have been really weird for people. Yes. Oh, it moved.
Yeah.
Good. So first of all, thank you for the kind invitation or acceptance. And I want to add that this talk is actually the product of three people, Bridget and Matt, who are unfortunately not here. Bridget works for Alpheus, and you are all her, you can find Matt and Bridget basically social network identifiers here. And Matt works for the University of Hamburg, where he works for a medieval Latin Chartres publication project. Okay. Here is the plan of the talk. Sorry. So we will go through those 6 parts, and let's start with the introduction. I'll start the talk by saying the following. Community growth and software uptakes seems incredibly difficult things to be successful with. It's extremely hard to do that. And it's not limited to DH. It's something that is much wider than just DH. We have a lot of examples of this. Just think about the European infrastructures. Things like Daya, Clarin, or even the unsuccessful Bamboo, who actually came to an end because it failed to find its community. So we cannot put all these failure on the back of users. It's just not users not coming and not taking the time to find what your software is good for. It's actually an issue also of developer and institutions. There is a space for CapiTainS where people heard about our software and our guidelines, liked and expressed their likings for the suite, but ended up not using it. We are not talking about people who just put whomever software in their proposal just for the sake of name dropping. We are talking exactly about enthusiasts. And these people in this zone is what this talk is going to try to focus on. These people are from really different backgrounds. Engineers and researchers that identify themselves as digital humanists, researchers that wants to bring the digital to their humanities project, people with only XML skills, people with Arch Linux, Mac, or even Windows. You get the general idea of who we are talking about. So how do we resolve this issue? Before diving in why people did not take on CapiTainS as their code base, I will probably need to present a little CapiTainS. CapiTainS is a project which is not specific to an institution. If I had to compare CapiTainS to other DH projects, at least what we want it to look like, I'd say that it should look like Epidoc or TEI for the community side of things. A suite of guidelines and software that gets improved by this group, by these users, where not one, but many people are actually deciding on the next step to take and the few things to talk about. Because that's what our idea of academic software is. This is exactly the principle behind our mind. Academic software should be commons. the same as Epidoc and TI. Unfortunately, we'll see later that this is yet a goal to achieve. If CapiTainS is not specific to an institution, I want to stress this: CapiTainS will not exist without them. We think it's extremely important to note that CapiTainS was born in the context of Perseus, and the humble chair of digital humanities in Leipzig. Nowadays, it lies in the institution, to our knowledge, of the Ecole Nationale de Chartres, Hamburg Universität, Perseus Project, Alpheus, Perseus, and the private company Eldarion. And each of them invests various time in CapiTainS. So finally, what's CapiTainS? It's a suite of software and TI encoding guidelines that try to reply to four major parts of digital philology: editing, serving, curating, and reading text. This means we have software or the likes that try to reply to all this question. We build software to help kick off the development of project with the general idea that doing so, we encourage people to provide APIs or text in open repositories. At the core of this idea is that CapiTainS must provide tools to produce or harvest citable text API, such as the canonical text services. Because it's born in the context of Perseus and Perseus, we actually focused originally on CTS, canonical text services, as the main data model for whole toolset. We have been moving away from it for the past 2 years, and we will discuss it later in the talk. As a short introduction, though, here is a list of the main software or tools we built and a short introduction to them. So the guidelines, they are actually a diversity of metadata expression formats, as well as some nodes that you need to put in your TI or Epidoc to express some general information about your text. It's all about making simpler to reuse text in our application later. Sparrow, which was the first piece of software we built, is a JavaScript library to handle CTS APIs. It is unfortunately in a really bad shape, exactly because it was the first thing we built. And so this is something we have been looking at to rework completely from the ground for the past year or 2 years. And unfortunately, there is much more things to do before going back to Sparrow. My CapiTainS is a Python library to work with text APIs, guidelines, following or text following our guidelines, metadata graph, etc., etc. It's a core component of all our Python tools, but it can be used for research or for smaller scale apps if you have Python knowledge. Booktest is a command line tool to check the compatibility of a corpus with CapiTainS guidelines. It's mainly used on the continuous integration service Travis to simplify the workflow of creating textual repositories. So basically, you edit your text on GitHub or GitLab, things get sent to Travis, Travis runs Booktest, and you get a general idea of how your texts are doing regarding the guidelines. Finally, Nemo is a Python web skeleton to serve a reading interface to your users. Its whole system is based on a concept of CapiTainS code resolver, which goal is to read data from local directory or remote APIs. Which means we actually built API as well, and that's for Nautilus. Nautilus is a Python web, no user interface. Its only goal is to provide APIs based on the guidelines. You give it your text, it produces the APIs. So as you can see, we have actually a few different tools which induce a split communication, a maintenance load, repercussion of general decision on more than one software generally, because everything is built more or less on my CapiTainS. If we decide to change data model, we need to change every other software. Even if we are keeping good versioning, it takes some time to move from one big version of my CapiTainS to another, because we need to make sure that everything works together. And it also introduces a question on what we should train people on. With so many software, what do we do? What do we focus on in terms of communication? Do we focus on our guidelines like we have done for the past 3 years? Should we focus on my CapiTainS, etc., etc.? Well, now that we know what CapiTainS is, let's actually tackle the main question of this talk. The first thing we will discuss is how do we get more users using our software base? So what did the software base prevent? So as we said, CapiTainS is based on CTS. As a short definition, CTS is both an identifier system and an API specification that provides the ability to know what text you have on your website, lists the passage identifiers available for this text, and finally, how to retrieve this text. It's a really, really neat way to do these things. It's basically a tool to answer the question, how do I retrieve the text I'm weird 1.1? And it works really well. Unfortunately, even if we were really happy with that, and we came to people saying, hey, that's a software that you can use and contribute to maybe. We've had so many people hours in this. Why should people do the same? You know, just come using our software. And then we eat some wall. One of these walls was simple. The CTS data model and specification, as good as it can be, are way too much specific to the Homer multitext. And to some extent, it luckily applies to Perseus. It's more or less the same domain, so it applies, but we will see that actually it has its limits. When we started presenting CapiTainS and its suite, people were happy about the result, but slowly people outside of classical text and even classical, what I would call classical static texts, there are Virgil, so, you know, 5th century, 6th century authors. Well, people were starting to show us the limitation of CTS and consequently CapiTainS. The best example I have today, and we will see that in details, is what would happen if I were to rebuild papyri.info using CapiTainS. And this is thanks to discussion with you, KLS. We discussed that, and it actually fed what I'm going to present. The first issue is CTS is based on an identifier scheme that says an edition is a version of a work from a specific text group. Understand text group as something like authors or something like the Bible. We don't have authors, but we are still grouping text together. And edition of this work should represent the same text, and to some extent, passage identifier should be shared across edition. That's the general idea. If I ask 1.1 of the Aeneid, every edition should more or less reply the same content. Unfortunately, if you want to follow the specification clause, this becomes either extremely artificial or complicated once you apply it to sources that are not canonical. Let's take a papyrus. What's its text group? What's the text group of a papyrus? How can you specify the text group of a papyrus? Is this the place where you found it? The publisher, the volume of some paper edition? What's the point of having work plus edition? There is most probably gonna be some huge difference in between edition of papyri. Let's not even talk about inscription, right? And what's the citation scheme? The word, the line, the letter. What about fragments? How do you deal with the numbers? So good side of this is you provide a shared API architecture. Bad side, if you really apply CTS to papyri, you end up with unnecessary made up information just for the sake of the API. Second issue, amount of text. To remind you, CTS was built with the Homer multitext in mind, and probably the Perseus corpus as well. That means that corpora will be about a couple thousand text maximum. For the Homer multitext, actually much less than that. For engineering, it was so to work with this kind of text, with this kind of amount of text. Let's take Papyri number of text. 54,9076 text with transcription. 87,844 text was in total. For each text to comply with the metadata scheme of CTS, that's at least, and that's a really conservative count, 180,000 duplicated nodes of metadata description just to introduce the text. The issue is CTS does not come with pagination. So when you give the catalog of your website, you need to give the full catalog. That's a huge bait. I did some raw computation. The current Perseus 5 has about 2,448 texts, which makes for 168 megabytes. Papyri.info would have a XML answer of 57 megabytes if I were to browse a catalog in this context. So let's say it doesn't really scale with the number of texts you have in your own repository. A last thing is reliability. It's an issue that I find problematic with CTS. CTS wants to be technically independent. That's something that has been said in talk and in papers. CTS is sought to be technical independent. It's not tied to XML. It's not tied to RDF. It's technically independent. Well, it's a really good idea, unless you want to share an API. The thing is, if you look at the documentation, the part where you must put the passage of your text, when you require the passage of one text, it doesn't specify in which format you need to give it. And because it's actually inside XML, other XML nodes, you could have CSV inside XML, XML inside XML, base64 PNG inside XML, which doesn't make it reliable. It's actually one big issue right now. If I crawl an API that is not based on CapiTainS, I actually don't know what will be the kind of content I will get into it in between the passage nodes. So it's not something easily sold to data consumers. There is this great API, and it is a great API. This is a great idea, but actually, depending on the implementation, who knows what you're going to get. Our reaction for a too long time was, well, you can force whatever data you have into CapiTainS. It's going to work. But Papyri.info actually really shows that we have limitation. And if you have this kind of really big project or non-classical data, we have the example of PhD thesis, a PhD thesis catalog that someone wanted to build. It's incredibly difficult because the structure of the PhD thesis text can move a lot and it's not regular. So we have issues to describe the text in CTS terms. So we moved, we moved from CTS to another data model. And we started working on something called DTS with people from people like you, KLS, from Papyri.info, Jonathan Roby from the X-ray specification vehicle studies, Jeffrey Seaweed from ACTA, lot of mostly classical and medievalist, but we started working on that. And so along starting working on DTS, which is short for distributed text services, we moved the CapiTainS data model to it. That was where we were, right? This is exactly the same thing we did wrong with the first move. Do not stick too close to a specific API data model because you're going to find issues, mostly when this data model is actually only a draft. So yeah, we moved from MyCapitain 1.00 to MyCapitain 2.00, but we missed so many things that we should have corrected. We forgot particularities from CTS, which are creating weird situation. And we also used, for really wrong reasons, DTS-specific vocabularies inside our code base, which actually do not exist anymore in the current draft. And now we have all things mixed up, and we need to move to 3.00. As we move to 3.00, we try to adopt a new approach. We are calling for feedback on some specific change, even more than we did before. We try to publicize every change, call people for feedback. Of course, it's still not the pair programming dream where everyone has a perfect understanding of the consequences of these changes, but at least we're trying to create a discussion before merging it all together. We make sure to keep track of these new changes. We try to not use DTS as the main data model, but as a data model. We have also taken the counterintuitive decision to move to more code complexity. That feels really bad to say. That feels also really bad to write in your talk. But by sequencing a lot of code parts in PCs that could be replaced for other purposes, we made sure that other people could actually use without duplicating code passages. And that makes the code more complex to read, but that makes the code more reusable. Just as an example, I'm actually gonna open this issue, maybe. Let's see. So this is just, yeah, it's fairly technical potentially, but this is exactly all the changes that that are currently happening between 2.00 and 3.00 just for the citation data model. So we have this data model, and here are the things that we think needs to move or needs to be clarified. And then there is a discussion between developers of CapiTainS. That's an example, and we are trying to make things clear. Just function names sometimes it can take actually a long time to agree on what should be done. Okay, so now we have some keys for the code base. Let's talk about documentation. This is a really difficult topic, right? So, as any good willing engineer, the first thing we did was simple. We tried to document every function, every object method, every attribute to the point where we will be able to understand the code later down the line. We thought about our we of the future, as I usually teach to my students. Like, think about you in 3 months and how angry you're going to be if you don't understand what this function is actually doing. We thought a little about our colleagues who would fall onto our code base, and the error we did, we actually thought it would be enough for other people. Well, let's be clear, we did not only do function documentation, we did a little more. We introduced schema of our class depends on themselves. After some time, we even introduced narratives about the why and the how some part of our code, some part of our data model came to be. But it was not enough. And to be fair, there is still a lot to do to improve the software API documentation. We'd also believe that tests are somehow a good way to introduce people to your code base because you see what it's supposed to do. Well, either we're really bad at writing tests, either I think that actually some things that engineers think and are wrong about. The tests are written for machine. they are not for the user to understand them most of the time. We try to keep all of that up to date also, but every time we point to someone of our code, people would just not be able to catch up. So, you know, we update our documentation, but just people don't get it. There is two reasons for that. Sorry. There is two reasons for that. Our code base is starting to be large. If you want to fully embrace CapiTainS as a developer, there is up to 4 software libraries or application and 1 guidelines set you need to know. Things are pretty clear from my perspective, but it became apparent in talk with close colleagues, even Matt and Bridget, that the responsibilities between these software packages were not always clear. That meant that documentation at the project level needs to be reworked. Second, what we should really have been focusing on for people to keep up with CapiTainS should have been, example, Python notebooks and actually tutorials. So the question here is the following. Why do people might really like CapiTainS but never use it? And here, one of our current example is, well, that's pretty repetitive. People need examples. We ignored this need for a couple of years before introducing timidly example in the major software. But as of today, we miss real-world example in most of our big software packages. And that's mostly due to the fact that we do not really know what will be what will make the best examples. We have more or less let MyCapiTainS be a complicated tool for the time being. MyCapiTainS is a software library that is only usable by people knowing their Python well. And we might not want to focus on them now. We should produce 1 or 2 tutorials, but this is not enough, and it's certainly not is the core. CapiTainS will grow if we get more corpora and more projects adopting its data. From this body of users, we will potentially see also researchers that want to use this data. Until then, it seems doomed to be a proxy for, MyCapiTainS seems doomed to be a proxy for other good packages, Zure, CLTK, or just as a tool to retrieve persistent text. So to make things clearer, MyCapiTainS is great, but it's too complex. And it's just going to be something that is used in other packages, I think, for a long time before actually people start to pick it up. So outside of MyCapiTainS, we have Nemo, Nautilus, and Hooptest. Right now, we want to focus on making building websites easier. And so we are focusing on writing tutorials and tools to make it easier to pick up these tools. Since we submitted the abstract for this paper, we created 2. A tutorial for Nemo aimed at developers, and which is the first link, and an app with documentation that does not require you to do Python for most of its configuration. Doing so, spending this amount of time on bypassing the complex parts of the Python code, we are expecting to reduce the skill ceiling needed to embrace our suite. And that's what you want, actually, when you have this kind of software. And we'll probably continue to do that as much as we will continue to improve our code base. We'll focus on creating something like the Nemo template app that is meant for people to just build a website in 5 minutes if you're familiar with Python, and about an hour if you're not, because it's only based on XML, actually. The configuration is all in an XML file, and humanists, well, actually digital humanists, tend to be really fond of XML. So that's for documentation. The last point we have always been looking at, and maybe we looked too much at it, is workshop. This was our focus for making people adopt our software. We focused on training people. In the past 4 years, Bridget, Matt, and I probably have covered a dozen training in person, and probably a little more if you count the remote workshops. Yet, the user base did not grow. We would have thought that training people, will make people like CapiTainS and push them to install our little wonderful suite, interact with us, and we were definitely wrong. So our goal was to expand our user base, yet close to 0 external text providers after a dozen of training. Let's start with this. What did we do? We trained people mostly for building text according to our guidelines. The main thing we saw behind this is you could be inside Perseus. How lucky you will be. Like, that will be wonderful for you. You don't have to care about building the website. But actually, only a few people respond to this incentive. People also have their own funders, and they want to be on their own website. And we say, you could build your own website. You could have an API really easily. The issue here, Perseus apart, is the word could. You could have a website. Yes, you could. Yes, if you spend a lot of time reading your documentation. So what's the point on focusing on training people to produce text when actually people really want websites? The TI is something important. The guideline is something important, but people want to go to a workshop and come back with something they can show to their funders or colleagues, not XML TI that follow CapiTainS guidelines. So what do we train for? UpTest, this seems to focus on text production again and not serving text. It's something we introduce people to in our corpus production workshop, but the code base is really limited to this exact purpose. My CapiTainS, we talked about it, it's mostly for research, and it even might be too high level for most of the researchers. It might be limited to people from CLTK and the likes. So then we have Nemo and Nautilus, right? Things that generalize out of the box to anyone who has produced TI XML. It promises, well, that's what we say, a quick access to publishing your text both in APIs and user interface. It builds on the CapiTainS guidelines, so we need to introduce this, but we can actually also propose a base corpus to showcase its ability to fit more than, let's say, Mediterranean-focused classics. This is the second thing. Most of the time we present it with classical text. Actually, Nemo and Nautilus can work with modular text as long as you push it to the data model and until 3.0. So, training for Nemo, is that actually simple? Well, this is something we have kept saying. Nemo is simple, and here is the issue: we did not know our public. That's something that was really wrong from us. We never re-evaluated the skills of our audience and the skills required for our code base. We were 3 Python developers. So instantiating a class and running a server, well, that's easy. Yes, apparently not. So, this paper, and I can't stress this enough, this paper was a really good thing to do because it led us to do an autocritique that was actually, I think, really efficient for CapiTainS. And it led to many talks about this. To come back to Nemo and CapiTainS in general, you might need to know Git. If you want to use the full power of it, you might want to know Git. So if you might know it, we need to find way to train people to actually not use it. And that's complex because a lot of my the CapiTainS world is actually built on us thinking that you need to engineer your text really well, but you don't have the time, half-day workshop to do Git, continuous integration, Python development, up to, server building. You just don't have the time. So we need to find a way to make it simpler. People will need also to run software from a terminal. Here, at the moment, we have found no other way to deal with that. We have some partial solution which depend on you having GitHub account. So we come back to the first issues, right? But if you want to really play in a workshop, you will need to be familiar with terminal. An issue that is, I think, not limited to us, Windows. It's often an elephant in the room between developers. We just don't speak about it. Though I did a training 2 weeks ago, half the room was on Windows. So that's an issue. And we have found way to deal with that earlier, like Docker. Docker is wonderful. You can run mostly with the Docker UI. It's something that virtualizes machines on your computer, and that really works well. Except you need a really strong computer. So, you know, academia doesn't have always the best funds, and you always end up with computers that are 15 years old and probably under Windows XP. And here Docker doesn't work. So still we need to find ways to make it more acceptable. And the last thing we think CapiTainS needed when we presented stuff was the ability to act code. That was the case until recently. This is something that we thought people would be able to get. You know, just open a Python file and change some value. It's, you know, to us, it's just a string. It's just 5 characters. And then you're in front of people and they're like, what's UTF-8? Do I open that in Word? I'm taking probably stereotyping a little too much, but that's one issue. Not caricatures, sorry, not stereotypes. Anyway, we found a way to make that simpler with the Nemo template app, for example. And we were able to limit the skills for hacking code to actually only needing to know a bit of XSL or pseudo languages or as Jinja template syntax, which are basically conditioned in HTML. That's close to XSL, and our public will most likely be TI encoders who most probably will know a bit of XSL. And so we're focusing on just the web part that they are probably most used to. They have TIs that transforms them to HTML, and then right now they only put the HTML online. And our goal is, okay, you can continue to keep this skill set, and there is something that you can use that generates the whole website for you. And you don't end up with a static website, but you end up with a website that has an API or APIs, actually. So the future. Well, we need to make sure people live with something they produced, preferably of interest to their own work or research. They'll have to encounter problem with us instead of at home or at the lab. And we will find the solution at the same time. It will also be necessary if we want to make things simpler. We just want people to encounter the issues with us. Workshops should be intensive and in person. Remote workshops just don't work. Probably promote full days workshop so that we can divide in sessions of different topics. We want to be able to take our time. We should not take more than 6 or 8 trainees per trainer because we'd lose the ability to help. We haven't thought that 2 or 3 trainee is even better. 2 or 3 trainee per trainer, even more so if they are using Windows, because we don't know how to do with Windows. We should produce a better version of Nemo that erases the difficulties for beginners. And as I said, that's something we created really recently. That's some kind of easy demo that makes you want to use the whole thing. You just spend this hour and either you like it or you don't, but at least you have an idea of what it does, not only with slides. And that's actually your goal here on the right side. We want to be as good and as simple as a blueprint for a Lego plane. And then you want to keep it a plane, or you want to make a space shuttle, then do it. But I think that's the engineer dream. being as simple and as modular as something like that. As I said, we started it, and it's not perfect, but we are close to that. But it took time and a paper to think about that. So as a conclusion, there is obviously a lot of other things to do. We are still not on the digital classicist wiki. We should probably provide translation of our website. We have been focusing on English, and I think that's really wrong. Mostly because I'm French, actually, and Matt lives in Germany. So why not focus on people that actually are not really good in English? We started really recently to send regular Twitter message calling for feedback, asking people, so you heard about CapiTainS, why don't you come join us? And we are open to answers. Like someone said, I don't understand what's the point of it. Or someone said, I don't understand the documentation. This was easier to treat, but what does CapiTainS do is something that is really hard to fix for us. Because we do know what CapiTainS do, and we try to explain it. We're saying that the explanation is clear, but apparently it's not. And so you need to reevaluate these kind of things. We put this kind of call every month, yeah, I would say. And for now, we have had few feedbacks, but it's always pushing us, I think, in the right direction. Again, taking the time, I don't know, 3 months since acceptance of the paper, to think about why CapiTainS failed in this area was actually something that was really useful. Just take some time, reflection, just, okay, so here we are, what did we do wrong? And take your time, write it down. And that was excellent. We have much more ideas today of what we need to do. We still have the same amount of time, so it will take more time. But we know a part of things we need to fix. Within this autocritic, the last thing I want to say is we actually discovered an underlying issue, is that the CapiTainS world is revolving way too much on 3 to 5 people. And it's not going to be better if we do not find new collaborators. The lack of growth did not help, but it has definitely been an issue that the core decision remained between Bridget and I for a really long time. And even if probably all decisions were submitted to Bridget and Matt, for example, it ended up being mostly my propositions. And that's an issue. It means that the underlying schematics and purpose of the software lies clearly in my mind, but is only submitted for approval. And if you only need to stamp your colleague proposal, then it means you need to make sure that you understand the goal, the final goal. And this became really apparent really recently when Matt actually moved to text producing to web app producing. And someone I was working close with for 3 years came to me and asked me, well, so Nautilus, Nemo, what's the relationship? And I felt lost because it's been 3 years I was presenting it and I thought it was really clear, but actually the responsibilities between those software was not clear to one of my closest collaborators and probably one of the persons that promoted the most CapiTainS. So we need to make sure that the architecture is clearer to the community. And this is why community growth is important. It's not about people using your software itself. It's about making it better. It's about making it clearer, actually, to other people. And it's better if other people use it, because the point of open source software and things like CapiTainS is the idea that we can reduce some cost that's really economic to focus on what we really want to focus on, philology or history. whatever your specialty is. We don't care about producing software itself. What we want to do is growing our philology or field. So community should be both an and. Growing, making the community grow means your software gets bigger and is more visible and solves more issues than your own. But it's also a mean, because community will make your software better just by sharing it with it and discussing it and making every call open. And that's my conclusions. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Thibault. That was really interesting. And I think that your, let's say, self-critique really resonated with a lot of other digital projects. I was seeing, people nodding and saying, yeah, I did that too. So thank you. We're going to stop the broadcasting now, okay. And you will be answering to our questions after.
Okay. So I just click.